The Genesis was a genuine rival to the Super Nintendo, its competitor boasting more beautiful graphics, while the Genesis countered with faster hardware, one of gaming's great console wars. But don't let that speed reputation fool you. Some Genesis games pushed visuals further than anyone expected. These are 20 of the most beautiful games the console ever produced. Warlock the movie didn't set expectations high, but the Genesis tie-in surprised everyone by actually demanding brains over brute force, playing a modern-day Drew racing to collect 6 ancient stones before the villainous Warlock could unravel in creation itself. This leaned tactical in a genre usually built around bigger guns. The main lightning bolt attack came paired with a genuinely clever secondary mechanic, an orb that trailed behind the character and could be manually controlled to hit enemies from awkward angles or grab otherwise unreachable items. Enemy variety demanded real strategy too. Some swooped in, others charged, some fired arrows from range, forcing players to read patterns rather than sprint through levels Contra-style. Sound design nailed the tone throughout, creepy music paired with hit sounds that varied depending on what got struck, metal, flesh, or stone. Visuals leaned a little rough, enemy animation frames stayed limited, and the Warlock himself looked fairly bland next to the hero's more detailed design. This stood out as a genuinely original tactical alternative to the usual run-and-gun crowd. Taz-Mania followed the standard platformer blueprint, a friendly-ish character, a simple quest, hunting down a giant tasty egg across deserts, jungles, mines, and factories. Nothing here reinvented the genre, but the game stayed fun anyway, right up until the controls got involved. Jumping made up most of the gameplay, and precision here proved genuinely painful. No real control over jump distance, blind leaps everywhere, and Taz seemingly incapable of small hops, sending him straight into pits meant for tiny platforms. The spin attack caused similar chaos, sweeping up enemies and health items indiscriminately with no way to stop it mid-spin. Combat took an unusual route instead. Players swallowed enemies for points, avoiding bombs while pepper granted temporary fire breath and food replenished health. A fresh twist on standard platformer combat. Music leaned flat and forgettable, more ambient filler than anything memorable, though sound effects picked up some of that slack. Frustrating controls aside, this delivered a genuinely fun, lengthy cartoon platformer worth pushing through. Crusader of Centy got compared to A Link to the Past constantly, and fairly so. Same tilted top-down view, same grass-cutting sword swings, similar handsome protagonist. Sega developed it before choosing Beyond Oasis for Western release instead, leaving Atlas to bring this one over on a limited print run. The real hook came from losing the ability to speak with humans while gaining the power to talk to animals and plants, recruiting them as companions who could grant elemental sword attacks, speed boosts, or distraction abilities, equipping 2 at a time and discovering surprising synergies between pairs. As sword throwing became essential too, boomeranging back and often the only way to damage certain bosses. Visually, this ranked among the best looking games on the console, lush swaying grass, particle effects, and genuinely massive boss sprites with real moving parts. Translation came off rough throughout, undercutting an already unfocused story, and the soundtrack, while occasionally excellent in battle themes, mostly stayed forgettable, never quite building to a satisfying payoff. Combat leaned thin over its 8 to 10 hour runtime, but the animal companion system alone made this a genuinely memorable, gorgeous oddity worth tracking down. RoboCop vs. the Terminator carried a massive expectations from the title alone, and it mostly delivered. An imaginative mashup leaning hard into fan service from both franchises across levels spanning old Detroit, the T-800 factory, and a creative take on Skynet itself. Combat played out as a standard run-and-gun scroller, starting with an unlimited ammo handgun before opening into surprisingly varied weaponry. A grenade launcher whose projectiles could be steered mid-air stood out as a clever touch. Most missions boiled down to clearing enemies toward a boss, though hostage rescues broke up the pace occasionally. Presentation carried real weight too. Deeper levels unlocked genuinely spectacular visuals worth pushing through the difficulty to witness. That difficulty ran brutal, most players wouldn't make it past level 3 on normal, and despite the title's promise, no mission let players control the T-800 at all. The sound effects landed awkwardly, jump physics fell off throughout, and the final boss, a giant endoskeleton head after a lineup of far more fitting enemies, didn't match the story's escalation. Frustrations aside, the sheer imagination on display made this worth the price of admission alone. Thunder Force 4 stands as the series' clear peak, Technosoft going bigger and brasher than ever before, opening with a heavy metal riff that promised exactly the adrenaline rush that followed. Stage Select let players tackle levels in whatever order they preferred. A nice touch, even though every stage still had to be cleared eventually. Enemy waves came relentless, genuinely difficult stretches that cost real lives, but maneuvering beyond the screen edge gave players room to dodge that plenty of shooters never offered. A mid-game upgrade, the Lightning Sword, arrived right when it mattered most, and collectible orbs granted homing shots, blade projectiles, and backward-firing railgun rounds, adding real variety to combat. Bosses ran massive and distinctly designed, demanding different loadouts to bring down. The soundtrack carried the experience. Metal Squad in particular still cited as one of the greatest tracks the Genesis ever produced, techno-rock energy fueling the whole playthrough. Some stages leaned subdued next to the game's flashier moments, a minor dip in an otherwise consistent presentation. This remains one of the finest shooters on the console, difficult and unforgettable in equal measure. Game Freak, the studio behind Pokémon, cut their teeth on magical Taruruto, a platformer built around an anime few Western players ever saw, and it showed real polish from the opening screen onward. Combat here worked differently from typical platforming. A stationary spear used to skewer enemies and objects that could then be thrown, paired with gliding and a range of magical abilities from temporary invincibility to offensive attacks. Boss variety stayed genuinely impressive, each fight demanding a different approach, from fleeing certain encounters to hurling objects in others. Visuals carried real charm too, pastel colors throughout, expressive smiling clouds in the early levels, and creature designs like the treetop giraffes that stuck in memory. The story, rooted directly in the source manga about a bullied student teaming up with a magical troll, never got an English translation, leaving non-Japanese speakers to piece it together elsewhere. Replay value stayed thin too. A completed run took under an hour with no bonus content. Short length aside, this stands as one of the best platformers the Genesis ever produced. Zombies Ate My Neighbors threw nearly every horror trope into a blender and refused to take any of it seriously, arming players with a squirt gun as their primary defense against zombies, evil dolls, and mummies. That silliness carried through every corner of the design. Household objects doubled as creative weapons, soda cans thrown grenade-style silverware that one-shot werewolves, fire extinguishers that froze enemies and left them vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Success depended on speed, memorized layouts, and real strategy, rescuing all 10 hostages per stage, while conserving rarer weapons for tougher encounters. Hedge maze levels tested all three at once, outmaneuvering chainsaw-wielding pursuers by exploiting predictable AI patterns rather than fighting them head-on. Difficulty ramped up sharply as new enemy types and environmental hazards, spikes, electrified barriers, collapsing walls, stacked on top of each other across all 55 levels. Beating Dr. Tongue at the end unlocks one of gaming's most delightfully bizarre credit sequences. It's a full extra level built entirely around the staff themselves. Beyond Oasis wore all the trappings of an RPG. Health and magic bars, overhead perspective item inventory, a fantasy island setting. But underneath, this played closer to a beat-em-up wearing RPG clothing. The dagger stood as Allie's core weapon, and it packed genuine fighting game flexibility. A backward slash launching multiple enemies airborne, a flaming spin attack to clear surrounding threats, a somersault strike to finish stragglers. Chaining these could clear a room of 5 or 6 enemies in seconds. Elemental spirits added real tactical depth too, summoning Ditto the Water Spirit near water for healing, or Ifrit for raw offensive power, making death genuinely rare unless players got reckless. Combat stayed relentless throughout, nearly every important area heavily patrolled by soldiers, beasts, or exploding snakes. The island itself stayed small, only 2 villages and a handful of enterable buildings, and dungeons ran short and simple, mostly key hunting through chests rather than genuine puzzle solving. A full playthrough wrapped up in 4 or 5 hours. even less on repeat attempts. Judged as the fast, athletic action game it actually was rather than the RPG it resembled, this delivered a genuinely satisfying, if brief, adventure. Asterix and the Great Rescue tasked players with the usual routine, rescuing Getafix from the Romans while switching between Asterix and Obelix, each with slightly different advantages. Asterix could duck and jump better, while Obelix could hurl rocks at enemies. Level identity carried real personality, walking across a literal Frankfurter-themed stage, a bright and bizarre color-heavy world, funfair equipment scattered across another. Boss fights leaned unconventional too. One required throwing fish at a musician to stop his terrible playing, a fun twist on typical combat. Music stayed pleasant if occasionally repetitive, and graphics generally impressed, even if the manual oversold a few backgrounds that never made it into the actual game. Difficulty swung wildly between stages. An early level that demanded frantic bomb throwing under tight time pressure, while several late-game stages felt trivially easy. A log roller boss midway through offered zero guidance on how to beat him, pure guesswork that stumped players for years. The story wrapped up abruptly too, no real closing sequence, leaving the adventure feeling unresolved. An average outing overall, worth a single playthrough but unlikely to hold attention much beyond that. Treasure's Genesis library gets summed up almost entirely by Gunstar Heroes and Dynamite Headdy, but Yu Hakusho deserved just as much recognition, particularly for a feature barely attempted today, genuine 4-player simultaneous fighting. The roster leaned wonderfully strange, Urameshi's balanced moveset perfect for newcomers, Kuwabara wielding a slow but powerful energy sword, demon fighters like Jin controlling wind, while Hiei fought as an ice-wielding swordsman, alongside nature-themed characters who could summon plants or turn into whipping vines. 2 universal parry options set combat apart, leaping backward to dodge close attacks or ducking into the background to avoid projectiles entirely, creating genuinely tense exchanges. An energy meter powered special moves and depleted with use, replenished by holding an attack button, forcing real risk management between aggression and strategic pauses. Music leaned generic and forgettable standard action fare that never stuck in memory the way the fighting system did. Tracking down the hardware for full 4-player chaos takes real effort, but this remains one of the most genuinely original fighters of the 16-bit era. Konami finally broke Castlevania's Super Nintendo exclusivity, and Bloodlines turned out to be a genuine gem, weaving in real historical figures and pulling closer to Bram Stoker's novel than any prior entry. Set during WWI, John Morris, wielding the vampire killer whip, teamed with Eric Lecard to hunt down Dracula's niece, Elizabeth Bartley, across Greece, Germany, and Italy, before she could resurrect her uncle. Combat differed meaningfully between the two heroes. John played like classic Belmont, diagonal whip strikes and wall-hanging traversal, while Eric's lance let him pole vault across gaps, giving each a distinct feel, despite equal damage output. Sub-weapons took a fresh spin, a boomerang blade replacing the usual cross, alongside an axe, holy water, and a power orb unlocking stronger item crash attacks. Presentation stood out remarkably. Water reflections early in Stage 2, a rotating Leaning Tower of Pisa sequence, and a soundtrack from Michiru Yamane, who'd go on to score Symphony of the Night. 6 stages ran brutally difficult, NES level tough in places, and continues stayed limited, though a password system softened that blow considerably. This stood as a genuinely worthy series entry, historical depth and all, on hardware Castlevania rarely touched. Flashback made Conrad Hart Gaming's cyberpunk parkour pioneer, running, rolling, and leaping across handsomely hand-drawn environments, an alien planet drenched in purples and pinks, a muted, melancholy Earth. After crash landing on the Moon Titan following a Botech chase, Conrad's journey to reclaim his stolen memory unfolded across levels laced with instant death drops and toxic green plasma. Rotoscoped animation gave Conrad's movement genuine fluidity, landing safely, running into walls, traced from real motion capture years before that technique became mainstream in film. His toolkit stayed sparse but essential, an endless ammo pistol, a precisely timed force field to deflect projectiles, and eventually a teleportation device, none optional against the brutally challenging default difficulty. Flashman stood out as a memorable antagonist, bursting into a green blur after taking damage and sprinting unpredictably during that first encounter. Music stayed sparse, brief clips at the start of new areas and short cues tied to specific actions, leaving long silences that at least let players hear approaching danger like beeping mines. A tightly paced, uniquely told cyberpunk story that still holds up as genuinely fresh decades later. Sega rushed Sonic the Hedgehog 2 out just a year after the original, likely reacting to Super Nintendo pressure, and while it never quite matched Mario World's polish, the speed-focused platforming still held up well. Dr. Robotnik returned to chase Chaos Emeralds while enslaving animals, and Tails joined as Sonic's new sidekick. The spin dash stood out as the real addition, curling into a ball for a burst of speed that doubled as an attack. Layered onto the same ring collection system and a loop-heavy stage design from before, level variety improved too. Casino Zone's pinball-style bumpers introduced something genuinely new, and Emerald Hill Zone remains arguably the series' most iconic stage. The soundtrack marked a real step up, more upbeat and bouncy, with cleaner drum sounds pulled from the hardware. Playing as Tails offered no mechanical difference despite his flight ability being heavily advertised, and his AI companion added little, prone to getting stuck on scenery. Later stages suffered from slippery, momentum-heavy controls that made short jumps frustratingly inconsistent, refined rather than reinvented. This remains a fun, well worth playing sequel despite its rushed origins. The Genesis quietly built a reputation for excellent licensed games, and Gargoyles followed that tradition, translating Disney's darker animated series into a solid action platformer with real polish. Goliath cursed since 994 AD to remain stone until his castle rose above the clouds, woke each night atop 1990s Manhattan to fight injustice. A premise that sounds ridiculous but somehow worked. Exploration across 5 distinct stages stood out as the real strength, breaking through walls, scaling structures with precise jumps, and triggering weight-sensitive doors reminiscent of Prince of Persia. Visuals carried the package too. Well-animated sprites, colorful environments, and strong parallax effects capturing the show's moody atmosphere. Combat fell noticeably short. Poor collision detection forced players to stand directly on enemies to connect slashes, and attacks never interrupted enemy counterattacks, meaning damage dealt often meant damage taken back. Pouncing became the only reliable option, reducing what could have been a varied moveset into a one-trick strategy, especially against bosses. Combat gripes aside, this stood as a genuinely satisfying couple. Hours of Disney license action worth adding to any Genesis collection. Castle of Illusion opened with a deceptively slow pace, no run button, Mickey walking at a speed that seemed oddly casual for a rescue mission. That skepticism didn't last past the first level though, and once the genius behind the level design became obvious. As Sega's first tentpole platformer, this avoided any comparison to Mario, carving out its own identity a full year before Sonic did the same through speed instead. Level design worked almost scientifically, enemies spaced with precision, jumps timed to keep momentum flowing despite the slower movement, and set pieces carrying every stage, hopping across spiderweb-strung leaves early on, a punishing staircase climb, rewarded with an exhilarating slide finale. Visuals still hold up remarkably well, backdrops rendered like pixelated oil paintings that justify convincing plenty of NES owners to make the jump. Replay value stayed thin, only 5 short levels with barely any hidden content beyond a couple diamond stashes, and the easy mode decision to strip out bosses entirely after just 3 levels felt like a bizarre gatekeeping choice for a game clearly meant to teach kids the ropes. Short and limited in scope, but Castle of Illusion remains a nearly perfect 2-hour experience worth returning to. Pitfall, the Mayan adventure, gave the Atari 2600 original a real story finally. Deep in the ruins of Uashektun, Pitfall Harry spots a golden idol and gets snatched by the villain Zakalua before he can grab it. His son sets off alone into the Mayan jungle to bring him home. Visuals held up remarkably well for the era. Vibrant colors and distinct designs across nearly every level. Enemies rendered with genuine care, and animation quality that stood out even against other 16-bit platformers of the time. Controls felt right out of the box, needing essentially no adjustment to feel comfortable. Gameplay leaned fast and satisfying, momentum-driven movement carrying most of the fun, simple to learn without ever feeling shallow. Sound design impressed just as much, sharp effects paired with a soundtrack whose Genesis rendition of the main theme stood out as the best version across every platform this released on. Difficulty leaned easy throughout, which might leave players craving more of a challenge looking elsewhere. This earned genuine replay value, a satisfying adventure worth returning to long after the first playthrough wraps up. NHL 94 stayed instantly approachable. Learn the pass and shoot buttons and you're already competent, though quick one-timers, blistering slap shots, and manual goalie control gave experienced players room to go deeper. Exhibition, 2 playoff formats, and a shootout mode covered most bases, even without a true season option, which felt like a genuine missed opportunity. The small rink kept pacing feeling genuinely fast despite modest player speed, and small touches sold the atmosphere throughout, body checking opponents into the glass or penalty box, fans pounding the glass, a Zamboni circling during intermissions. EA Sports packed in the full 1993 roster, including new expansion teams like the Florida Panthers and the Mighty Ducks, with individualized player ratings and hot/cold streaks adding real depth. Sound design impressed especially. Over 70 pieces of organ music varying by arena, crowd reactions tied to in-game events. Visuals held up decently with proper uniforms and lighting details, though noticeable pixelation crept in player models here and there. Missing season mode aside, this remains a genuinely fun, replayable hockey game that holds up better than plenty of modern entries in the genre. If A Link to the Past played like Dark Side of the Moon, Landstalker was never mind the bollocks, Sega's abrasive punk rock answer to Zelda's polished mythology. Nigel wasn't a legendary hero, just a treasure hunter chasing riches alongside the fairy Friday, and the tone stayed cynical throughout, especially once players reached Mercator, a city steeped in gambling, corruption, and greed under a dictator duke. Movement demanded real mastery, an isometric perspective requiring diagonal directional inputs just to turn Nigel toward where you wanted to go, weighty and deliberate compared to Link's featherlight steps. Jumping became essential too, cramped rooms full of enemies forcing precise positioning, and platforming segments played like 3D paintings, deliberately ambiguous about exact platform placement, punishing miscalculated leaps with real setbacks. Combat rewarded preparation over precision alone. Up to 9 healing Ike fruits kept Nigel in the fight, with Friday automatically reviving him if stocked. World map exploration grew visually repetitive, mostly green grass and brown dirt regardless of distance traveled. Punishing and demanding, but genuinely rewarding for anyone drawn to unconventional Zelda-adjacent design. Capcom brought Strider to Genesis as one of its earliest arcade ports, and even without spawning an annual franchise like their bigger series, it earned a lasting reputation among hardcore players. Hiryu, a ninja infiltrating the Soviet Social Republic to stop the reality-bending Grandmaster, scaled Kremlin-like buildings, fought through an airship, and battled dinosaurs in a jungle. Wildly disconnected settings that somehow worked together. Hiryu's plasma sword carried surprising reach, upgradable until it could stretch across the entire screen, and his acrobatics set him apart immediately. Wall grappling, mid-air flips, downhill sprints nearly matching Sonic's speed. Level design leaned hard into verticality, scaling structures and dangling from ceilings while fending off relentless enemy waves, and boss fights escalated that challenge further. One in particular disrupted gravity entirely, flinging Hiryu around the room while players tried to land hits. The soundtrack landed genuinely unpleasant, closer to random synth key mashing than actual music, and screen slowdown crept in during busier fights, likely from the game's oversized sprites. Difficult and occasionally rough around the edges, but Strider's acrobatic combat and level design still hold up as genuinely impressive for the era. Sega's home conversions of their own arcade classics didn't always deliver, but Golden Axe on Genesis turned out surprisingly well made, more than most ports of the era managed. Beginner mode functioned as a training run through half the game, while arcade mode delivered the full campaign with a few necessary trims to stage sections and enemy placement. A bonus post-game stage rewarded finishing Death Adder, tougher enemies, pit-laden terrain, and a brutally unfair recolored final boss capable of summoning Tyrus Flare's dragon at will. Likely burning more continues than the campaign itself. Bosses lost their ability to shove players away on approach, a fair adjustment over the arcade original. Music translated impressively well, and while combat felt loose, it stayed fun throughout. Enemies simply vanished on defeat instead of turning to stone, a minor downgrade, and mounting beasts while corner became annoying. Characters auto-mounted immediately and without the brief safety pause the arcade granted, often getting knocked around before escaping. Rough edges aside, this stands as a genuinely great conversion worth adding to any Genesis collection. 20 games, one seriously underrated library. The Genesis never won on raw graphics, but between speed, style, and sheer variety, it earned every bit of that rivalry with Nintendo. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel and drop a like, it really helps. I'm Edward, thanks for watching, God bless, and I'll see you next time.